here speaking with you on my spiritual journey. I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Sam Garman, and I've been a member of this meeting since I think I officially switched my membership to this meeting in 2007. But I had a spiritual journey that began before then, and so I wanted to tell you about that this morning. My initial inclination was to be kind of cheeky and actually start this presentation in chronologically in the year 1840 and end it in 1979 with my birth. Because as you will see, a lot of my spiritual journey sort of began and was laid out on a path that happened before I was even born. Because the original Samuel Garman was born in 1840 and came over with the rest of his family. Gradually his family emigrated from what is now Switzerland to the United States for reasons of avoiding conscription into the various warring city-states that were in Central Europe at that time. You'll go to the next slide now, Ron. And the family story was that that Samuel Garman and his wife Rowena, they were both German Swiss immigrants. They eventually settled in southern Michigan, and they had 13 children. And one of them was Carrie Garman, that's the woman, right? That's my great grandmother. And the story was that Samuel Garman, the original one, got on the boat to avoid conscription in Switzerland and got off the boat in the United States and was promptly conscripted into the Union Army to fight in the Civil War. And this family lore is that once he got home from the Civil War, he did not touch a gun again in his life. The next slide, yeah, thanks, Tom. But the other side of my family, my mother's family, the Van Vlecks, they'd been in the Americas for longer. That's my grandfather, George Van Vleck, on the left up there. And that's my mom and her two sisters on the right. But both sides of my family were profoundly affected by World War II. And my grandfather fought in the Pacific. George, my other grandfather, who was too old to enlist, was drafted to work in a factory in Cleveland and spent the entire war building bombers and taking the train back to Michigan when he could. But that experience of World War II profoundly affected the family for the next generation and led to kind of the resistance to the Vietnam War that would characterize my mother and father's generation. And my parents' relationship arose directly from resistance to conscription and my father seeking a conscientious objector status. And that's was them. That's my parents, Mary and David Garman. They are the signposts and the path on my spiritual journey. And when they were first married, they were caretakers at Kalamazoo Friends meeting in Kalamazoo, Michigan. That's the building. That's where it still takes place today. That's where it was in 1971 when they were married. And it's an urban meeting where friends meet in a circle of chairs, a lot like this one, every morning in kind of a library space in the upper level of that building. And is the kind of place where when I returned to visit that meeting 25 years later, a lot of the same people were still there that were there in 1971 when my parents were there. And after that experience, my parents attended Quaker seminary and were at the Earlham School of Religion and were and they were residents in the dormitories at Earlham College. And they met a lot of people who were Earlham students at the time who would become important people in my life, including Stan Smith, who some of you might know as a member of our meeting here, Benita Washington Lacey, many other people during that time. And as they studied at the Earlham School of Religion, they both became ministers, recorded ministers, and were recognized as such in the Quaker community in that area. And that continued in all of their that's all right, Ron. You're just working with my slides, and I appreciate you doing what you can with the slides. Too close. It's very sensitive technology here. It's quite all right. I'm sensitive to you. But when that was a sort of an identity for them, and when my dad went home to the farm, he was responsible for saying grace at the dinner table, and my parents, for their whole lives, have officiated the weddings and funerals of nearly every member of our extended families who needed one. And they eventually became co-pastors at Second Friends meeting in Southwest Indianapolis. And that's where they were when I was born. My first conscious memory is the staircase at the parsonage where they lived just around the corner on 1814 Lambert Street in Southwest Indianapolis. It was a working class area, a working class congregation. I met a lot of people who would be influential in their lives, in my life, like the Baptist preacher Charlie Julian, who became my dad's very best friend, and that's not him. But on the right there is Greg Porter, another friend of theirs who they met at that time. He's now a state legislator in Indiana, and they engaged in activism as part of their spiritual journeys at that time. As an infant, I was taken to Birch Bayh's office. That's Birch Bayh's over there, the senator from Indiana, to protest the draft, but Second Friends. So yeah, Second Friends meeting. That's the building where it used to be. It has been laid down since. It does not. People still met there to worship. But yeah. So, but my parents were pastors. It was a Gurnier meeting. And so my first meeting for worship, I was born on a Sunday. My first meeting for worship was May 20th, 1979. So that's when that happened. Right. Next time. Eventually, my parents left that position. My mom always said, you start out as a pastor in a meeting or a church, and you're good for a couple of years. But then people start to get antsy and mad at you. But they had me, so that got them to a little bit of grace, because a new baby in the congregation is a reason for celebration. So, and then 2 years later, people were getting antsy again, but they had my sister, so that lasted. But eventually, the honeymoon is over. So my mom got a job at West Richmond Friends meeting in Richmond, Indiana. As a pastor. My dad got a job as a pastor at a small meeting for worship in Centerville, Indiana, and we moved to Richmond, and that's where my first earliest clear memories are living. We actually lived in the small city of Centerville, which is right outside of Richmond, Indiana, and my earliest clear meetings come from there, from living in the going to Pauline Trueblood Nursery School at Earlham, on the campus of Earlham College, and visiting different meetings, and the beautiful house in the country we lived in. That house did not survive. The whole time we lived there, there was a fire, and we lost the house. It's also an important part of my spiritual journey in terms of the loss of that. That was my Yeah, as I say, my first clear memories are from that time, and my first clear traumatic memories, the night that house burned. We weren't present when it caught fire, but, we was out visiting friends, but I remember very clearly seeing the remains of the house and everything that we lost. And so my mom got her degree and and we moved to Chicago, Evanston, Illinois, outside Chicago. And she taught her PhD at Garrett Theological Seminary in Evanston, Illinois. And my father, meanwhile, was training as a chaplain at Presbyterian St. Luke's Hospital in Chicago. And Evanston Friends Meeting is where we went then, and that is where my earliest first day school memories are. And the same, we're going to West Richmond, which is also a Gurney meeting in Richmond. I remember what they called the children's story there, which is what which was at a point during the service, they would call the children forward and tell a story. A special story, so not unlike what we do here at Family Meeting Worship sometimes. And but Evanston Friends Meeting was my earliest. I'm sure I had been to unprogrammed meetings before at different times in my life, but that's the first time I remember going to unprogrammed Quaker Meeting for Worship. And the sanctuary at that meeting house, which you can see right there, is what I picture in my mind when I think of a Quaker meeting. A Delphi meeting, if you've ever been to a Delphi meeting down the road from us, it strongly resembles, an Evanston meeting strongly resembles Delphi meeting. And I remember clearly, that's the first place I remember hearing clearly ministry that I heard in meeting for worship from people. I remember particularly a meeting, a ministry from a woman. She must have been very young. I mean, she seemed old to me at the time because I was 7, 8 years old, but she must have been very young, standing up and giving a story about a car fire that she had and how she had lost her car, but when she went to look at the wreckage, she found her purse, which was smoldering, but the items that were in her purse were fine. And she opened up her purse, and that was very meaningful to me at the time. I just remember her. She was, when she stood up to give this message, she was. I remember seeing her and thinking, oh, she must have just come from that car fire because it burned up her shoes because she was not wearing shoes. Now I realize she was just a hippie. But at the time, that's how I experienced it. Anyway, next slide. Then when my mom did get her degree, we moved back to Richmond, Indiana. She taught at Earlham College. My father became the hospice chaplain at the local hospital, Reed Hospital, and we continued to attend unprogrammed meetings of worship, this time at Clear Creek Friends Meeting, which is held on the campus of Earlham College in Stoughton, New York. And that's the same building where I had attended nursery school at Olive Nursery School when I was younger. And really rich first day school memories from this time. The first day school teachers were people who were professors at the Earlham School of Religion and Earlham College, people like Michael Burkle and Mandy and Herb Frazier and Hugh Barber. And rich contributions from community members like Nancy McDowell and Herb Kimball and Cecile Holvick, and who played the piano for us to sing hymns. Her husband Len was the choir director at Earlham College. And it was really in Richmond during those years that I was really enveloped in a Quaker community in ways that I didn't even realize. And now we come to the sort of digression of my mother is a particular lover of theater and musicals. And I saw the movie version of Fiddler on the Roof at a very impressionable age. And I was transfixed by the idea of a religious community like that, living in a religious community like that. without sort of realizing that I already kind of did live in one. In Richmond, the house we eventually lived in was partially built by Quaker builders. My parents bought bread from the Quaker baker. I learned driver's ed and how to use a computer from Quakers who taught at the public school I attended. And, you know, and the way that these things in the Quaker community in Richmond is prominent and large enough that we were known, but we were also a minority. And in the way of these things, that meant that sometimes at school I was actually bullied for being a Quaker. And it led to, you know, it led to identity, it led to thinking about what it meant to be part of this community, and it led me sort of to think about the activist part that my parents had already engaged in as part of their work as pastors and teachers in the Quaker community. And so things happened to me, like learning about Hiroshima and the atomic bomb was sort of the source of my personal commitment to nonviolence. And when I talked to my dad about giving this presentation, he told me that actually it was the same for him. And for me, it was being shown a movie in 7th grade by I think a well-meaning teacher named Kelly McDermott. She must have been impossibly young at the time, much younger than I am now. She was our social studies teacher, but she showed us this movie, Hiroshima Out of the Ashes, which to me at the time played like a horror movie, because this is not a great work of art, but it is, I think it was a TV movie, but it shows this, just the astonishing suffering of people on the ground in Hiroshima after the bomb was dropped. And that's really the whole story. There's not a lot of extra political context in it. And still the most horrifying thing I've seen in a movie or anything is a bit in this movie where a little boy hears his grandmother knocking outside the door, and he opens the door, and just all the flesh is been flayed off the body. Just a horrifying thing to see. And that visceral experience and thinking about what it actually meant is the source commitment to nonviolence more than anything else in my life. And my dad says the same thing about his experience of reading books about Hiroshima when he was young. But also I became aware of social justice through other things like the AIDS advocacy my parents did. When I was very young in Chicago, my dad introduced me to one of his patients, who was a man named Daniel, who was suffering from AIDS. And it was, in the context of the time, it was a political act for him to introduce his children to Daniel. And that, I don't remember when I first became aware of that as a justice issue, particularly instead of just meeting a friend of my father's, but that was something that I experienced, it led me to care about justice for queer people. And I was definitely bullied more for wearing that button on my backpack in high school than I ever was for being a Quaker. And also at Earlham College at the time, there was a lot of anti-apartheid activism, and I remember one of the anti-apartheid actions that people took was building shanty towns on college campuses, and they looked. That is actually a photo. It's not from Earlham, but it's a photo from a campus activism of building a shanty to protest apartheid in South Africa. It's not, it's not the real thing. But the other thing that happens in my spiritual journey in Richmond was joining the Richmond Young Friends Quaker youth group. That is where I learned how meaningful worship actually worked, and the rudiments of how Quaker process worked. And I formed a lot of friendships with Quakers and non-Quakers who were members of that group. And some people were members of that group because they were children of Earlham faculty or friends of friends. And we, during the spring breaks at the public high school, we, almost all of us attended, the Richmond Young Friends would go on work trips. And we went to Philadelphia and Oklahoma and Virginia, visiting with friends and doing service work. Go ahead, Lena. Like the leaders of Richmond Young Friends were very important teachers to me: Becky Sharp, Janet Fiskio, Jennifer Dickey, Michael Crumley Effinger, and many other people involved. Sarah Gelser, who's I know photo on the right, the one on the left of Michael, the guy with the beard. Sarah Gelser was an Earlham student who went to Philadelphia with us on one of our trips. She's now a state legislator in Oregon. I'm very proud to have known her. And the guy in the middle is Jordan Taylor. He was Lauren's son-in-law. He was not with us most of the time because he was a Westtown student, but when we went to Philadelphia on our work trip, he and Al Holzer and a few other, Tahoe Kakatani and a few other people who were Westtown students joined us. It's special anyway, but the first Friends meeting house in Richmond, Indiana, the Richmond Young Friends met at the West Richmond meeting, which is a normal sized meeting house a lot of the time, but we also met at First Friends, and the old First Friends meeting house building had been originally constructed for Indiana yearly meeting and was just enormous. Too big for a regular sized Quaker congregation. It was impossibly large inside, full of strange hallways and mysterious doors. The building was used for all kinds of community events like soup kitchens and actually, the local Jewish congregation had Hebrew school in it for a time before their temple was built. And that building, it was really too big for what was needed, so it no longer exists. It has been torn down. It's now a CVS there. But after it was torn down and before the new First Friends Church was built in Richmond, the First Friends met at the synagogue where they in Richmond, where they had once, so there was an exchange there, which was very meaningful. And another important spot on my spiritual journey was Friends Music Camp. That is a camp that has not run for a few years now, but it was a spectacular institution. It arose from the Quaker community in Yellow Springs, Ohio, and created by a woman named Peggy Champney, who ran the local Yellow Springs newspaper for many years. She passed just a few years ago. And it started out meeting at Only Friends School in Barnesville, Ohio. Really beautiful, open, rural campus. But in its last few years, it had moved to Earlham College. And it's sort of been a casualty of COVID and Earlham's financial troubles. But that was where I engaged in the daily practice of Quaker worship and cemented my understanding of what meaningful worship really was. And when I went to college in Kalamazoo, just as my parents had. And I went back to Kalamazoo Friends meeting, returning to a meeting where my parents had been residents, and that's the room where they actually meet. And that is the place where I first gave ministry in meetings for worship, with adults at least, we had sort of learned how to do it with training wheels on in Richmond Young Friends or camp or whatever, but that's the first place I did it in meetings for worship with grown-ups. Anyway, and after college, I went to work at Friends Committee on National Legislation. I was the intern on nuclear disarmament, and that's the old FCNL building. I think some of the stones are still probably the same stones there, but it's been remade into a pretty lovely green building. But it's on Capitol Hill. But 1 week into that internship was September 11th, 2001. So the response to that and sort of the questioning really led to a questioning of who Quakers even are and what Quakers are even for in a society like that. It's hard to imagine now in the way sort of political winds have shifted, but there was really a sense during those days that now America is united again, like in World War II, but Quakers were not part of it. Our perspective was not really welcome or interested. People weren't really interested in them in those days. I think maybe that's on back, but also FCNL is where I met my wife. And she was already attending here. We not when we first met, but just before we were married, she started attending here. And then we were married here and participating in Sandy Spring as an adult. It's still ongoing, but it's the most profound and complex part of my spiritual journey. I've been here longer now than I've been anywhere else. And as you can see on the right, Mandy, my beloved eldest child, was baby Jesus in the Christmas pageant. My other child, Howard, was introduced and became a member of as an infant, shaking a rattle in Betty Hoover's face as she welcomed him. And so I just want to close with a story that my mother told me of. She visited a church once. That was the kind of church where there's a band, and there was a child playing the drums in the band, and she was amazed by his skill. And then he switched out with an older member of the congregation, maybe a relative of his, and she realized, of course, he's got this skill. Of course, he knows what to do. He's watched it every week his whole life. And when it comes to Quakerism, that's me. I'm that little boy. I've absorbed kind of the rhythm of Quakerism my whole life. It doesn't mean that I know how to play, most technically advanced drum solo. But that's where Sandy Spring is sort of where I've been learning though how to read the music and follow the rest of the band and even sight read a piece now and then. And but sometimes I probably still play too fast. But I'm grateful to be here and for the chance to continue the journey. So, that's it. Thank you.
Wow. Two things. Hi, I'm Alicia, I'm Sam's wife. Just things that occurred to me as you were talking. One is that the experience of your house burning down in Centerville. You talked about the Quaker community that you were part of when you moved back to Richmond, but I have heard you and your mom and your dad talk about the way that that community really enveloped you when that happened and how important that was. So it began before then.
Yeah, Nancy and Tom Mullen, who were Earlham, West Richmond people, so attenders of the meeting, they heard that our house burned down, and the story is that they didn't even talk to each other. They just got in their car and drove out to get us. And we stayed with them until we found another place.
And the second is just the interconnectedness. The reason, we, even at the time where you started coming to this meeting, I guess we live closer to like 4 different Quaker meetings than this one. Like, this is not our local meeting. But part of why we come here is because when Sam moved to DC to start working at FCNL while he was looking for housing, he stayed with Stan Smith, his parents' friend from Earlham, who was a member of this meeting. And so he started attending here. And then when we were deciding when to get married or where to get married, we decided that this was the place we wanted to do it. And so we wrote our letter, and one of the people on the marriage committee was Beth Massey, who Sam's parents had known from Richmond. So
yeah, Beth and Frank and Ellie, Kathy, and Brian were our neighbors after the house burned. So they live 2 doors down from us in Bridgman.
So that's part of how we wound up in this meeting, was that those connections in that story.
Yeah, there's so many. And I felt like at different points in this, I was just dropping a lot of names, but there's so many more that I just, people I would drop. It's my, well, Fiddler on My Roof, it's my Anatefka.
So when I say I'm married into the Quaker Mafia, that's kind of true. But you work with one too. Yeah.
I'm really intrigued, Sam, by the different, your memories of the different Quaker meeting houses as well as the communities that were there. And, I grew up in one meeting, we didn't move all over, but to this day, I dream about that meeting house because we were always there, we were very active. My mother was cleaning out the RE room, my father was cleaning out the boiler, whatever, you know, it wasn't a meeting that's big, but it was that sense of community and people and place. Even though we say we can worship anywhere, there's certain places that just are so evocative still. And I hear that in some of them.
Yeah, I think it's quite true. When we were, I thought about that a lot, that kind of thing, when we were building this building and over at Ashton Meeting House for meeting for worship regularly. Just, you know, it's not really our way to consider the building itself as sacred or meaningful. And I think what I said at the time when we left Ashton Meeting House is that I don't think a building has a soul, but it has a history, and that little building over there is now part of the history of our meeting.
Sure is. So, yeah, thank you, Sam. I was wondering if you made a transition, or maybe it's your parents made a transition from a pastoral form of Quakerism to unprogrammed? Did they ever really reflect much about what that meant for them or for you?
It was never, the transition was never total. In the sense that, I mean, when we moved to Chicago, there was not a Gurney 8 meeting available to us, so that's really why. I mean, if we wanted to go to Quaker meeting, we had to go to unprogrammed meeting. And but we still, the 3 meetings in Richmond, Indiana at that time, and I think still were pretty close. They're close geographically, and they're intertwined. There's not a lot of, you know, there's important differences between Indiana yearly meeting, Western yearly meeting, Ohio Valley yearly meeting, the different, the new Association of Friends now. But in terms of Richmond, the Quaker community has always been pretty united during my lifetime. So I went to West Richmond Friends meeting all the time, and First Friends plenty of times while I was growing up, and it was only a gradual realization that there really was much difference at all. I mean, obviously, there's a difference between going and listening to pastor and speaking of being mad at the pastor, I mean, the pastor at West Richmond Friends meeting and my mom did not get along for many years. And so being mad at the preacher is kind of a recurring theme in my family history too. My dad's family didn't go to church growing up. He was not a preacher growing up, obviously, but because the Methodist minister, my grandmother Rolene was mad at him, so they didn't go there. So that's sort of it's kind of a Midwestern, I think I've talked about it in a meeting for worship before. It's kind of a Midwestern phenomenon when you have these small towns with one church, you know, the person who's mad at the pastor, so they don't go to church.
Maybe they should rotate pastors every 2 years.
But yeah. But as far as the transition, I would say that it probably has a lot to do with welcoming queer people, the transition to unprogrammed versus programmed friends. There was just not willingness in a lot of the Gurneyite friends in Richmond at the time to welcome gay people into their congregations. And whereas I remember same-sex weddings taking place in Clear Creek from a very young age at the time. And my parents, I would never say that was the focus of their activism. They were peace activists before anything, but my parents had gay friends from very early on in my life, and was important to them. My mom stopped doing weddings for a while at all until during the time when people wouldn't, when it was a cultural flashpoint of whether or not we would let gay people get married in this country. So she stopped being willing to sign the paperwork. I think she still performs ceremonies, but she stopped being willing to sign the paperwork for the state during that time. So I think that's probably what they did. I talked about Pauline Trubla Nursery School where I went to school growing up. When I was little, Pauline Trublood was the wife of D.L. Trublood, one of the famous Quakers, but he was famously opposed to inclusion of gay people in Quaker life. He was famously opposed to it. I remember reading an article in the Palladium Item newspaper, which is Richmond's newspaper when I was young, about Quakers come out against gay people. It was an interview with him where he said basically, and he took sort of what was the liberal position at the time, which is that, in your private life, be who you are, but you can't be public like that. That was, so, I think I would have to confirm that with my parents, but I think that's probably a lot of what it was about, just sort of the, this political. Yeah.
I was wondering, how do you see nonviolence work being part of the solution in the Middle East today?
2 minutes.
I think. That's sort of the same question they asked Gandhi about Hitler, isn't it? I mean, do you really think nonviolence could stop Hitler? And he just said, not without great suffering first. And so that's what we're having, right? We're having the suffering that's been going on. And FCNL doesn't support political candidates, but FCNL has always said, I guess David Culp, who's not a Quaker, but was a longtime FCNL employee and one of the most politically practical people I've ever met, just a brilliant activist from Indiana originally, actually. He said, at some point, there's got to be an election and you have to make the right choice. And that's the solution. The leaders are what's wrong with the conflict right now. We need better leaders. The hostages who are still prisoner in Gaza, their families are like the families of people who were killed on September 11th in our country. They don't want war. They just want their family back. And that's, I've said this before in meetings of worship, but the words that are never far from my heart in meetings of worship are the words of G.K. Chesterton, and the red-haired urchin girl that he saw out the window one morning with long red hair, being cared for by her mother, a poor Irish woman, and he sees this girl with her mother and the long hair, which is a sign of pride for her because her hair hasn't been cut short, even though poor people's hair would have been cut short at that time to avoid disease, to avoid lice. But he said, and I realized looking at her that all the nations of the world should fall before one hair on this child's head should be harmed. And well, to me, what that means, and the work that my wife still does at FCNL and that I've been involved in, is I mean, we have nations, people have sorted into nations in this world, that's how we're involved, that's how we're politically organized, but there's not, you know, a nation has an army. And so this, you know, the short-term solution in the Middle East is political, and it involves violence, because it involves armies, it involves sitting at a negotiating table, drawing a line, saying, this is the Palestinian nation, this is the Israeli nation, and they will both have their police forces, they will both have their armies, you know, and that's everybody who is serious about this political issue recognizes that that's a political issue, but as a moral issue, you know, a nation is not a non-violent entity, so all the nations in the world shall fall, but not one hair on her head should be harmed.
Thanks for watching our video. For more content from Sandy Spring Friends Meeting, click to subscribe.